This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal, and I'm Jess Khannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Well, Jamal, we're still recording Arab Talk from our remote locations in Northern California. This happens to be the first day or two that we've had somewhat breathable air. The fires remain out of control in many parts of California and in Oregon. There's been an extensive loss of life and damage to property in the billions of dollars. We have a president of the United States who denies climate change in the face of hurricanes that are devastating the Gulf Coast and fires that are ravaging the West. But we'll continue to produce and report on Arab Talk. As long as we have any kind of internet connection, we'll be doing this. We have a lot to report today, Jamal. There's actually quite a bit to talk about. We're going to be talking about the Abraham Agreement, the kind of ridiculous fake branding of the peace in the Middle East accords between the Israelis and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, and how that's being played up. But there's kind of a bizarre story, Jamal, and I know you know about this, but apparently there's a large pro-Israel Muslim group that is really ready to support Joe Biden. It's kind of a crazy story.
That's right, and I wouldn't call it a large group. I mean, that's how they're presenting it, as the largest Muslim pack, but it's not, as we know that. It's just an exaggeration. And this is a great article and a great interview with Ali Abunimah, the co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, who recently wrote this article entitled "Meet Emgage, the pro-Israel Muslims backing Joe Biden." So, of course, meet Emgage. I've never heard of Emgage, and I've
never heard of him.
And we know a lot of people, right? But apparently they've been around, and they've been speaking on behalf of Muslim Americans, and basically they've catapulted right in the middle of the Biden campaign, claiming to represent Muslim voices, claiming to represent Arab voices, Arab Americans, even Palestinians. And Ali wrote a very good article. I advise everyone to look it up. It's right on Electronic Intifada and read it. So let's watch his interview, and we'll discuss it afterwards. Joining us today on Arab Talk, Ali Abunimah. Ali is the author of two books, One Country, A Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse, and the other book is The Battle for Justice in Palestine. He's also the co-founder of the Electronic Intifada. Welcome to Arab Talk, Ali.
Thank you, Jamal. It's my pleasure to be back.
You recently wrote an eye-opening article in the Electronic Intifada entitled "Meet Emgage, the pro-Israel Muslims backing Joe Biden." To tell you the truth, most Muslim Americans have not heard of Emgage. In your article, you wrote that the Washington Post described Emgage as the largest Muslim American PAC, or Political Action Committee. This is news to me, and that Emgage is now organizing what it calls the Million Muslim Votes campaign. I want you to tell our listeners and viewers, how did this come about? Who is behind Emgage? And how did this PAC all of a sudden catapulted into the Joe Biden's campaign?
Yeah, I got interested in them because this group, Emgage, they had suddenly been sort of visible everywhere. They scored a big coup when Joe Biden spoke to a summit they organized in July. Of course, it was online, but they got to brag that, Biden is speaking to our organization, and Biden has very rarely spoken to Muslim groups. And it was also interesting that one of the board members, Farouk Mitta, has been appointed by Biden as his so-called Muslim engagement advisor. And it was very odd to me that in July, Mitta was quoted in the Washington Post praising or lauding Emgage on behalf of the Joe Biden campaign. And the Washington Post did not disclose that Mitta is part of that organization. So, he was praising his own organization on behalf of the Biden campaign. So that's a really glaring conflict of interest. And it certainly warranted digging a little deeper into who this organization is. And what emerged is that this group, its official address is a Travelodge motel in Lakeland, Florida, that is owned by the Mitta family, Farouk Mitta and his father Amin, who is also on the board of Emgage. And the board and the staff of the organization also include at least 4 people that we know of so far who have been involved in the so-called Muslim Leadership Initiative, which is an initiative to take so-called emerging Muslim leaders on all expenses paid trips to Israel. And this MLI, as it's called, Muslim Leadership Initiative, is organized by the Shalom Hartman Institute. This is an Israeli organization that works closely with the Israeli army and is funded by the Russell Berry Foundation, which also funds some of the most Islamophobic organizations and individuals in the United States, people like Stephen Emerson, Daniel Pipes, and Robert Spencer, to give examples. So I thought it was very strange that, all these connections were there. And then when you dig deeper, you find that other principals in this organization, like the CEO, Wael Zayat, who is a former State Department official, also have very close ties with Israel lobby groups, including AIPAC and its think tank, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the American Jewish Committee, and the Anti-Defamation League. These are all, in summary, Israel lobby groups that play a major role in pushing for U.S. policies that are very explicitly anti-Palestinian. And then the other thing that was very apparent is that Emgage makes barely any mention of Palestine. Palestine was virtually absent from its website. It's not on its list of issues. And they're out there pushing for Joe Biden, who, continues to take very anti-Palestinian positions. So from the perspective of our publication, The Electronic Intifada, which focuses on Palestine, it was really important to dig into who this group is that claims to be speaking on behalf of the Muslim American community.
Well, I was also surprised that you also mentioned that their effort is backed by well-known national Muslim organizations such as CARE, MPAC, and Empower, the latter led by Palestinian American activist Linda Sarsour. And we know there was an issue with Linda Sarsour, and in fact with the Palestinian delegation trying to get involved in the DNC, and Linda Sarsour was attacked, and then there was supposedly a private apology. So what role do these organizations play? I mean, I'm actually surprised, to tell you the truth, by CARE, for example.
Yeah, some interesting things came up in some of my subsequent reporting. Once I published the first article, sort of the big expose on Emgage on September 9th, then a lot of people brought things to my attention. I was contacted by a lot of people who wanted to sort of tell me their experiences with Emgage and how they had their sort of doubts and grievances with the organization for a long time. And one of the issues that came up was this incident with Linda Sarsour, who was smeared by the Biden campaign basically as anti-Semitic. And instead of asking for an apology, one of the complaints, and I reported on this, was that Emgage instead tried to use that to sort of get concessions from the Biden campaign of sort of more jobs in Biden transition or Biden administration instead of an apology. In other words, people see this group as just a vehicle for the career advancement of people like Farouk Mitha, who I should also note is a former Pentagon official, and in that role, was involved in U.S. policy for a number of years, albeit at a junior level. But he was nonetheless part of the Defense Department, and so the question is, why are groups like CARE and MPAC and Empower Change signing up with Emgage? I mean, that's a question I can't answer on their behalf, but it could be that once Farouk Mitha managed to get this appointment by the Biden campaign, it was just a question of, if you can't lick them, join them. And, what they claim is that all these groups are joining together in something called the Million Muslim Votes Initiative. But it's not apparent to me that Emgage or even all these groups together have the wherewithal to register and mobilize 1 million Muslim voters as this Emgage initiative claims. And when I asked Emgage, how many voters have you registered since you started this initiative, I think back in March or April or whenever it was, I didn't get any answer to that question. So some people have said that, it's more about self-promotion than an actually serious voter mobilization effort.
Well, and we know they have zero outreach effort. I mean, if they want to have the Million Muslim March, we haven't heard anything.
Million Muslim votes.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard anything from them in the Bay Area. And then if they're trying to connect with Muslims, because we've had, and you have in your article, Ahmed Zaher on our show here, and he's slightly touched on this. He kind of just mentioned that he was kicked out from a Zoom meeting with representatives of the Biden campaign. And I didn't get it that time because he didn't mention Emgage by name, that he was actually kicked.
Well, what happened, and I've included this video in my article at the Electronic Intifada, is that I think it was back in June or so, there was a meeting hosted by Farouk Mitha in his capacity as Biden's campaign advisor with leaders and activists from the Palestinian American community. And the point that Ahmed Zaher was making in that meeting, and you can see it on the video, is that why is the Biden campaign treating the question of Palestine and the question of U.S. policy towards Palestine as a Muslim outreach issue, and instead of a policy issue and a foreign policy issue that requires proper treatment? In other words, Ahmed was offended, I think very understandably, that this was being treated just sort of as ethnic outreach. You just have to, placate and pander to Muslims. And the point that Ahmed made in that call is that the pro-Israel groups were given a meeting with high-level policy people in the campaign, not with sort of a Jewish outreach person, but it was treated from their perspective as a foreign policy issue, in contrast to the dismissive way that the Biden campaign and Farouk Mitha in particular were treating Palestinians. And when Ahmed made those points, Mitha cut him off and kicked him out of the meeting. And then, other people left the meeting in protest at that. So that's an example that happened several months ago of the kind of behavior that was already sort of percolating and circulating, which was generating a lot of questions about Emgage and its role and the role of Farouk Mitha and his very unclear role. One of the interesting things is that Emgage, in its response to my article, claimed, for example, that Mitta had left the board of Emgage. He'd formally stepped back because presumably so there would be no conflict of interest in his role in the Biden campaign. But actually, the documentary evidence shows that that's not true. As recently as April 25th, Emgage filed its annual report with the state of Florida, where it's registered, showing Farouk Mitta as one of its board members. This was almost 2 months after Biden had appointed him. And then as late as August 30th, the board, the Emgage website showed Farouk Mitta as part of its board. And then suddenly they removed the entire board from the website. So there's also a total lack of transparency and basic honesty in how Emgage is relating to questions about its role.
I want to take us back to MLI, Muslim Leadership Initiative, the Faithwashing, whatever, propaganda arm of probably the Israeli government, directly the Israeli government. You have two members who participated in the MLI trip, and I remember in particular their trip to Jerusalem and AlAqsa Mosque, and they came under a lot of criticism, and an altercation, by the way, happened on the ground, and then all of a sudden they kind of petered out, and now all of a sudden I see their name here. I have a major concern about the role if Emgage is the front to MLI or not. I mean, do you have any sense of that?
Well, what we know is that in total 4 people linked to Emgage have gone on these Muslim Leadership Initiative trips to Israel, which, as I mentioned, organized by this group, funded by the same funder as Islamophobes and with close ties to the Israeli army. That includes 2 board members or 3 board members rather, 2 national board members, Khurram Wahed and AJ Durrani, and a member of their Texas chapter board called Farouk Shamsi, and their Texas executive director, a woman called Nabila Mansour. And Khurram Wahed went on the MLI trip, I think it was in 2015. We reported on this at the time. And as you mentioned, there was this altercation where another member of that MLI delegation was involved in an altercation with a Jerusalem resident at AlAqsa Mosque, because this Jerusalem resident knew who they were and told them to their faces that, MLI is not welcome, that people coming with this, this Israeli initiative to Jerusalem are not welcome there. And there was an altercation in which it's alleged that one member of this MLI group assaulted the Jerusalem resident. And Khurram Wahed, the Emgage board member, was a witness to that. I spoke to him at the time, and I reported at the time on that incident. So I don't think there's any evidence that Emgage is sort of formally a front for MLI, but that's not how MLI works. MLI is really about cultivating quiet individual ties with so-called Muslim leaders in North America to create sort of personal friendships and connections with the Israel lobby that can be used to neutralize any potential criticism of Israel. And he used the term faith-washing, which I use in my article. MLI is a faith-washing initiative. What is faith-washing? Basically, that's when it's sort of a dishonest effort to portray the situation in Palestine as a religious misunderstanding between Muslims and Jews, instead of what it really is, which is a settler colonial occupation of Palestine, which has nothing to do with religion, even though Israel justifies its conquest of Palestine, as in religious terms. It's not a religious conflict. There is no ancient conflict between Muslims and Jews. But faith-washing initiatives try to place the conflict in the framework of a religious dispute. Why? Because number one, that erases the facts about what's actually going on. It erases the power difference between Israelis and Palestinians and turns it into, oh, well, it's a religious conflict, and the way to resolve it is not by ending Israeli occupation and colonization, but by having dialogue between Muslims and Jews. So this so-called interfaith dialogue provides a framework for faith washing and a framework for co-opting people like, the ones who go on MLI and misrepresenting the issue as a religious conflict and using that as a way to co-opt these leaders individually and really to silence criticism and really to sabotage support for Palestine by kind of buying off these various individual so-called Muslim leaders.
Right. We have a few minutes left, and as we are speaking, they're getting ready for the signing ceremony for the so-called Abraham Accords. And I want to know, what do you think about this whole thing, starting with the UAE, now Bahrain, and I've read this morning that Oman is sending an envoy. I guess the Trump administration couldn't gather all Arab leaders for this photo op opportunity, but Oman apparently is going to be next.
Actually, it's a beautiful sort of segue, because the so-called Abraham Accords is precisely an example of faith washing, referring to Abraham, that this is bringing together the adherents of the Abrahamic religions, again, to try to portray this as a historic reconciliation among religions, when what it really is a dirty deal between the Israeli apartheid regime and unrepresentative despotic regimes who are in it for the money, for the arms deals, for their own interests, and it has absolutely nothing to do with advancing Palestinian rights, as some of the apologists of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have tried to portray. And really, it represents a fantasy by Israel that the question of Palestine and the oppression of the Palestinians and the rights of the Palestinians can be bypassed, that if Israel makes so-called peace deals with despotic regimes hundreds or thousands of miles away, that the Palestinian issue will disappear. But this is based on a misunderstanding, because, regimes like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have never done anything serious for Palestinian rights. So it's not as if they are really a loss from the Palestinian camp. I think all this does is expose the reality that these regimes and others who will, reveal themselves soon, have been quietly collaborating with Israel for many, many decades. That's certainly true of the United Arab Emirates, whose ties to Israel go back at least to the 1990s. So we're talking about almost 30 years, and include secret deals to do with military intelligence. And even 4 or 5 years ago, the United Arab Emirates Air Force was doing joint exercises with the Israeli Air Force. So the effort to try to portray this as some kind of historic, significant breakthrough is fiction.
Ali Abunimah, I want to thank you again for coming on Arab Talk, and hopefully we'll see you again, maybe in person at some point.
I very much hope so, and thank you for having me.
And that's the voice and the face of Ali Abunimah, the co-founder of Electronic Intifada, speaking with us about Embrace.
Emgage.
Oh, Emgage. I don't know what the heck it is, but it's a pro-Israel Muslim lobby or political action committee that is in support of Joe Biden. I don't even know what to say, Jamal. I'm kind of speechless. This is the same group that was supporting was on the Hillary Clinton campaign in her disastrous 2016 campaign where she lost to Donald Trump. And now we have the same formation of groups, kind of obviously pro-Israel groups, funneling the Muslim voice on the Biden campaign.
Well, there are members of the Muslim leadership, whatever, MLI. We've discussed this before,
Yes.
This is, another group that was invited to Palestine, or invited actually by an Israeli organization to visit Jerusalem and go to the AlAqsa Mosque, and they were outed basically because they were on a Hasbara tour.
That's right.
And at AlAqsa they were confronted and told that they were not welcome there. We haven't heard from them, but apparently there are at least two members or two board members of that group who are now part of Emgage. So this is again, and this is something very important that Ali Abunimah spoke about, which is there is this whole campaign of faith washing, just like
faith washing.
Yes, faith washing is just to take Muslims who pretend or claim to represent Muslim Americans in the United States into propaganda tours or Hasbara tours. And the same thing now, the Biden campaign is courting these types of Muslims, kind of playing good Muslim, bad Muslim.
Right.
And then the interesting thing about it, actually, as I was speaking with Ali Abunimah, it was about just the same time that the so-called Abraham Accords were about to be signed in the White House. And Ali was quick enough and wise enough to comment on the name of the Abraham Accords.
Right.
Same thing, playing that game of the faith washing, because, using a biblical name, Abraham representing all monolithic religions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So try to kind of make that this whole peace deal is made between the children of Abraham. And just like a quick maybe footnote for people who maybe don't have an idea about the size of the UAE and Bahrain, you could fit the population, and I'm talking the indigenous Bahrainis and the Emiratis, not the foreign workers who work there. They are less than the population of Gaza. Okay,
right?
They're less than 1.5 million people. To claim that 1.5 million people represent the voice of 1.8 billion plus Muslims around the globe is a travesty. And that's the spin machine of the Kushner, Netanyahu, Trump is trying to do, to say we're bringing Muslims, from all across the globe to recognize Israel. And also, and I just want to, before we get into delve into the details of this, Jess, is that there is a clause, and I didn't read the two agreements, but I read the 4-page normalization agreement between Israel and the UAE, which was posted by the State Department. It's 4 pages. Okay, not a single word was about stopping Israel from annexing Palestinian land.
That's right.
Then there was a and this is also buried in the statements, funky statement saying that with this agreement, now Israel will allow Muslims to visit and pray, and they use the word pray peacefully at Al-Aqsa, like these Muslims, they just come, when they pray, they attack people, they create wars. To pray peacefully, it's dictating how they should pray and when they should pray and who would allow them in.
But it doesn't allow Palestinians who live in Jerusalem to go and pray. It doesn't allow Palestinians living in the rest of historic Palestine to come in.
Well, Palestinians in Jerusalem, they pray there, but it doesn't allow people in Gaza to travel, and doesn't allow people without special Israeli permission to travel from other towns and villages.
But even in Jerusalem, Jamal, you have to be over 40 years old to go there to pray.
So the idea, they are, and this is part of the language, and this is what, sadly, the representatives of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates are basically acknowledging that Israel is the key holder to AlAqsa Mosque, which is a terrible thing. So they are speaking on behalf of 1.8 billion Muslims and more than 330 million Arabs in the region, even though their combined population is less than 1.5 million people.
Yeah. So, Jamal, before we dive into the Abraham Accords, I want to go back to Emgage, whatever this group is that Biden is hitching his wagon to. And I think we talked about this last week, too. Part of what this is to isolate and to divide the more progressive voices within the Biden campaign away from the Biden campaign and away from the Democratic Party. You see the deep influence of pro-Israel forces wanting to isolate the Squad, wanting to isolate more progressive forces, and they're using this these Muslim groups that are being promoted by pro-Israel groups within the Democratic Party to be the stand-ins for all Muslim or Arab or Palestinian voices within the Biden campaign. That is a very dangerous game, Jamal, that
Absolutely.
they're doing. It's a very dangerous game.
Yeah, and last week our guest was Huwaida Arraf.
That's right.
And Huwaida was part of the delegates who went to the DNC and to find a little space on that table.
Very little.
A very little space, and try to help alter the language. And the language did not include Palestine or recognition of Palestine. They didn't want to use the word occupation. Even the word occupation, that the Israeli occupation actually exists in Palestine, they didn't want to use it. So it's the same thing.
So Jamal, so just so that you know, Bernie Sanders came out this week and said, you're making the same mistake that Hillary Clinton made. You're isolating progressive voices. You're shooting yourself in the foot. And what does Biden say today, Jamal? He lauded the so-called peace accords, the normalization between UAE, Bahrain, and the Israelis. So Biden, who publicly said that you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist, he claims to be a Jewish Zionist, is making many, if not most, of the same mistakes that the Hillary Clinton campaign made in 2016. And I'm going to say it again. I'm going to say it every week, Jamal. At your peril, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, if you isolate the progressive voices yet again, you're headed down a very dangerous path.
And we also had another guest also, Ahmed Zaher, who was also on the show. And he talked about this very topic. And in fact, at that point, he did not name during the interview Emgage. That's why I said to me, I told Ali, this was news to me actually finding out about Emgage and what they've been about, because we don't hear about them right here in Northern California. And frankly, we try to kind of monitor a lot of the news.
We do.
When Ahmed Zaher was invited to a Zoom discussion with representatives of the Biden campaign, the Biden campaign had the head of Emgage basically leading the meeting, and eventually he was basically cut off. Basically, they disinvited him from the meeting for raising the questions about Palestine and who they represented and so forth. When he started to kind of question their motives, he was basically uninvited from that chat room. So it's a topic we should really keep an eye on it, and I thank our guest Ali Abunimah and for his article and for uncovering.
I just want to. I think I want to emphasize this point, Jamal. We're less than 50 days away from the election, and we see the Biden-Harris ticket making many, if not most, of the same mistakes that the Clinton campaign made. And they're doing the same thing. They're jumping up and down saying what a terrible leader Trump is, rather than sticking to the specific policy ideas and policy statements and, kind of ideas that they want to promote and policies that they want to promote. They are headed in a very, I think, self-destructive direction. They got to wake up, Jamal. There's only so many days left. And the polling is a lot tighter than is being portrayed in the mainstream media, for sure.
Well, I agree with you. So back to the UAE and Bahrain agreements.
Come on, can we just say what it is? It's a complete joke. It's a complete joke.
So-called Abraham Accords. No, it's not. Listen, we have to look at it, the good, the bad, the ugly. Of course.
What's good about it?
Well, I tell
what's
you
good about it?
The good is not to you, for you to determine. It's not for me to determine. It was something good for Benjamin Netanyahu. It was something good for Kushner. It was something good for Trump, because Trump actually, even let's say if it lasts 48 hours, 1 week, 2 weeks, it was an achievement to have this back-to-back agreements. It does mark a diplomatic victory for Trump. Remember, he spent his entire presidency talking about the so-called deal of the century. That was a fiasco. He was also talking about solving this whole thing with North Korea nuclear program, and
that's a disaster. Yeah, that's a disaster.
And that was just all for show. And now he actually has something tangible where he brought two Arab countries back to back to sign a peace agreement. And so from that end, I don't wanna kind of take away from that victory. And of course, similarly can be said about Benjamin Netanyahu, who is really engulfed in major criticism,
right.
Because for handling, number one, the coronavirus, similarly to Trump, and for corruption. He's facing a corruption trial. He has charges of bribery, fraud, breach of trust, and people have been demonstrating in the streets. It basically gave them a new life. So we cannot dismiss this aspect.
But yeah, you're right.
Sadly,
you're right about that, Jamal. But let's be real. You called Bahrain and the UAE Arab countries. I think we should tell our listeners that are they countries or are they monarchies? Because really these are in the traditional sense of the way we think about countries versus monarchies. I'm not so sure I would refer to Bahrain and the UAE technically.
Definitely there are the despotic regimes, and also when we have this criticism, this is not directed towards the people of Bahrain.
No, not at all.
Or the people of the Emirates, because there are people, and I know that for a fact, and I actually received a note from a friend of mine in Bahrain. He's a known journalist and a blogger who basically was put in jail when there was a rebellion against the king, right? So part of this so-called Arab Spring, Bahrain, the people demonstrated in Bahrain to remove the king. And then guess who kept the king alive and buttressed him? It was Saudi Arabia, sending its own military to save his behind.
Right.
And so we know that, and we know what's going on in the entire Arabian Peninsula. You don't have democratic regimes there, and you have regimes that have to follow the dictate of the United States, and they're still under this whole colonial mentality, the remnant from the colonial time of the Brits, and now the United States kind of make the decision for them. So we know that. But again, nevertheless, this was a victory lap for Trump.
A victory lap for Trump and for Netanyahu, and maybe for the elites of Bahrain, the royal families of Bahrain and UAE. But let's be real, Jamal. This is not a peace plan for the Palestinians.
No, it's not.
The UAE, the foreign minister, had the outrageous gall to say today or yesterday that this agreement was going to help Palestinians. I mean, he felt, and he actually said those words.
That's the charade. And then he said something earlier, and he said laughable. I tell you what's laughable about it. You know what's laughable about it is that when you listen to Donald Trump, and you listen, to this whole propaganda thing that they're, these are warring countries and these are warriors and there is blood in the sand. Remember Donald Trump, we're going to stop the blood. What blood in the sand? There has never been a war between Israel and Bahrain or Israel and the UAE. They don't even share borders. So this whole thing, facade, that they've faced, conflict, that's nonsense. And that's what people, they see it, they call it a peace agreement. It's not a peace agreement because there was never a war between the two countries. I mean, that's kind of like, they ran away with that statement. The other thing is, I've mentioned to you the population that Bahrain and the UAE claim to speak on behalf of 1.8 billion Muslims. We're talking about basically a population less than the population of Gaza that Israel keeps under lock, basically, under siege from air, sea, and land. And they're not talking about that. And then with all due respect to the Emir, the foreign minister, Prince Abdullah, who said that this was done in good faith to help the Palestinians, that's nonsense. The Palestinians told him we don't need this kind of thing. They've already conveyed that message, whether we agree and we don't agree with the Palestinian Authority. They've conveyed it to him not to be part of this agreement. He's seen the demonstrations in the streets, that no one is supporting it. And also, there isn't a single word in the agreement about Palestine or about stopping the annexation. Benjamin Netanyahu can still do whatever he wants to do with the Palestinians, bomb Gaza at will.
Annex, steal more land.
Steal more land, keep Palestinians under apartheid conditions, so it's really,
what this is,
so
Jamal,
disingenuous. I mean, if they wanted to say, let's go back to the main reason, they want to get F-35s, which basically Israel and its lobby right here in the United States are against it, okay? Right. And that's what they want, and even Trump, he said, we'll talk about this. Let's wait until next year because, number one, we don't know if Trump is going to be in power. So that whole thing about the F-35, at the end, it might come back and bite them in the behind because they might come back empty-handed.
But Jamal, Joe Biden is not that different than Donald Trump when it comes to the issue of the normalization charade between the Israelis, Bahrain, and the UAE. Don't be surprised if UAE gets their little F-35s and Bahrain is reestablished with a military presence of the U.S. military there.
It's already there.
Yeah, but even bigger for payback for the normalization. I don't see
where most of the military in the Middle East, whether in Iraq, Saudi Arabia,
it's in Qatar,
etc. No, aside from this, where they go for R&R, they go to Bahrain and Oman.
Right.
Okay, that's basically their R&R destination. This is a well-known thing. But back to the thing, and this is dangerous, because they're touting that there are others coming. And I'm not dismissing this, because Oman might be the third country.
Right.
We're talking about Sudan, we're talking about Morocco, and others. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is now permitting El Al, the national Israeli airlines, to fly over its territory. Okay? Bahrain, the king of Bahrain, doesn't do a single thing without consulting with the Saudis.
Right.
And to a lesser extent, the UAE. But for sure, I know that the king of Bahrain, he does not get up from his throne to go to the bathroom without consulting with Saudi Arabia.
Well, because he's in power because of the Saudis, Jamal. Without the Saudis, he would have been gone.
So with the Saudis, with him coming here, he got the green light from Saudi Arabia. And with the Saudi Arabia allowing, basically, Israeli flights to go over its territory, that's the danger. And that's the danger is that, yes, you might have more from the Gulf states. You have now with the change in regime in Sudan, and Sudan is looking for financial aid from the United States and to get off from all these different sanctions, a way out to join the Israeli-American club, and also I know there are advanced talks with Morocco. So it does not look good.
No, it's not looking good, and that's why I say, I'm kind of concerned about this, because I don't believe that the Biden administration, especially with Harris, who's no progressive on Palestine, Jamal, I don't believe that a Biden administration will do anything to stop this. Biden has said nothing positive about Donald Trump except with this normalization agreement between Bahrain and UAE.
I mean, they're on the same page.
They are on the same page.
When it comes to Israel, it doesn't matter if you're from the Democratic Party or you are from the Republican Party, with few exceptions.
Hence why they're playing a very dangerous game, Jamal. And frankly, when all this attention is on, Bahrain, UAE, and the Gulf, why are we not talking about what's happening in Lebanon that's been absolutely devastated by, so many things, not the least of which is the bomb blast that occurred, the refugee problem, the devastation in Syria, the devastation in Iraq. We're not talking about how the United States and its surrogates and the Israelis have just completely destabilized and wrecked the lives of millions of Arab citizens throughout that part of the world. No, we're focusing on less than 1 million people in these thuggish monarchies.
And this is the message. And this is the message. And this is what's going to happen in the next months. Even if, as you said, even if Biden wins, okay, there is a strong message and there is strong sentiment in the Middle East that you're not going to get by without the United States, right? You need to befriend the United States. And the road to Washington comes through Tel Aviv.
Right.
So the road to Washington comes through Israel. In order for you to come on the good side, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, you must go through the Prime Minister of Israel. And for now, the Prime Minister of Israel is Benjamin Netanyahu, who has the strongest relationship with a sitting president in the White House than any former prime minister.
100%
Going all the way back to Ben Gurion, you're not going to get a stronger relationship, and it's a personal relationship. And there is, we've talked about it, there is the Jared Kushner connection, where Benjamin Netanyahu, when he used to go and come and visit the United States, would stay in his bedroom in New Jersey at his parents' house there. So the connection cannot be any stronger, and the connection with the U.S. ambassador in Israel cannot be any stronger, and the envoy, it's just like it's all 100% strong connection with the Senate, with the Congress. So Arabs are coming and saying, you know what? And this is a sad thing. We're not, do we still want to stay behind? And again, when I say Arabs, I want people to understand, I'm not talking about the average person. I'm talking those leaders and despotic leaders by and large. They're saying, we don't care about the Palestinians. We want to have good relations with the United States, and if we have to go and bow to Benjamin Netanyahu, we'll do that. And they're doing it.
No, I think that's right, Jamal. And we have to face the unfortunate reality that the Arab leaders have been throwing Palestine and Palestinians under the bus for decades now. That the aftermath of the Oslo Accords has been catastrophic and has facilitated other Arab despotic leaders throwing Palestine and Palestinians under the bus. And we're going to continue to see the process of Palestine no longer figuring into the calculation in these despotic leaders. Having said all that, when you, as you said, and I think you're exactly right, the missing calculation in all this is what's going to happen on the ground with everyday citizens of these countries who still, by and large, the overwhelming majority of Arabs and Muslims all over the world are undeniably supportive of Palestinian freedom, independence, and dignity and, all the rights that we have been talking about for so many years here. So there's going to be a further division between the leadership and the people of these various countries and these monarchies. And, I'll say it again, Jamal, at your peril, you want to continue to isolate people. You want to befriend, befriend a government that has been, just basically committing ethnic cleansing against Palestinians for 71 years now. You are very short-sighted. You want to exchange Palestine for a couple of F-35s, to your peril, man. Be careful.
Well, the only thing I can say is two things. One, that the Palestinian struggle has been ongoing for 70 years. Everything that has happened to Palestinians and has not dissuaded them from demanding and asking for their rights.
That's right.
From the children who are second or third or fourth generation, because we're now entering into fourth generation since 1948.
That's right.
They still hang on to the right of return to their towns and villages. So with that, as far as trying to extinguish the spirit, they're going to fail at this. And they're not going to solve, and they're not going to solve the issue and have this comprehensive peace in the Middle East as they're trying to do. They're basically trying to circumvent. They're trying to circumvent the Palestinians and march ahead. And then we have last few minutes, just I want to comment also, this is really a colossal failure by the Palestinian Authority. And those, and I'm not just going to, and then those who drank the Kool-Aid
of Oslo Kool-Aid, yeah.
And we've talked about this until our face turned blue about what's wrong with Oslo, and then every time we see what's wrong with Oslo.
Here we're seeing the reality of the consequences of Oslo today, Jamal. By these normalizations, that's the consequence of Oslo, and I will say this freely: failed Palestinian leadership. This is where we are today. Thankfully, Palestinians are much more capable than their leaders, and people will as long as Palestinians can determine their future, unlike the current leadership, we're going to be just fine.
That's right, and we're running out of time.
We are.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPO San Francisco 89.5 FM. We'd like you to, and we'd like to thank also our viewers on Facebook and also on YouTube. And go to our website, ArabTalkRadio.com, to download the latest episodes.
And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.